Before talking about the Therapeutae, and I'll get to where that word comes from in a minute. But before talking about that, I'd like to tell a story about an interaction I had with a man I used to work for. He was my boss's boss, and he was going through seminary school to become a deacon in the Catholic tradition. And he, we had conversations at work about all of the classes he had to go through, because nowadays it's a little different to become a deacon than it was a while ago. And a deacon, by the way, is a person who's married or a lay person who can participate in the Catholic Church, in the Catholic Mass. So he was telling me about all these different classes he had to take, and he was struggling through some of it because he had 2 little girls and a wife, and it was really a sacrifice for him to go through it. So my point is, I did seriously respect him for going through all that. He was obviously very committed to his faith. And I asked him a question that occasionally occurred to me, especially because I grew up Catholic, and I had all sorts of questions that I would plague my parents with, and they never enjoyed answering, and they wanted me to stop pestering them about it. So I took the opportunity to ask him because I knew I would respect his opinion. The question was, in order to be close to God, in order to experience a full relationship with God, is it more important to go to church every week, regardless of how we feel, or is it more important to maybe not go as often as every week, but still retain this closeness in our hearts? In other words, do we only go when we can actually experience that wonderment, that true relationship with God? And he looked at me kind of funny, and he said that I was missing the point entirely. And so I knew I was going to be interested in whatever he was going to say next. He said that the reason we go to church is not to experience a relationship with God. The reason we go to church is because we're supposed to go to church. And it seems like a very cold answer. But I understood the meaning of what he was saying. He was saying that there is love and there is a relationship with God, but the church gives us the opportunity to do, basically to give us the path for us, and we follow it, and as a result we may reach those things that we want to, but ultimately we are in the church because the church is the authority. If you don't like that story, I have another story which I think is a little funnier. Every now and again I'll have lunch with my mother, and we may get to talking about religion. Once she came here to see where I work, and she was looking at all the different things at the Theosophical Society. And so I took her out to lunch, and we got to talking about the second object, which is the study of other faiths, other religions, in a comparative way. And she said something very non-committal, like, that's a very good cause. And I'm like, okay. I'm like, well, have you ever studied Buddhism or Islam with a serious approach, with the intention of understanding personal truth, not just kind of knowing what they're all about? And she said, of course not. Like, don't I know better? And I said, well, why not? And she said, as a matter of factly, well, Corinthians 14:6. And I said, okay. And so the conversation was over, and I understood completely. No, that's not true. I said, I don't know what Corinthians 14:6 is. Would you please tell me? And she paraphrased it, but I have the exact quote here. Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And I think a lot of Christians recognize this quote, even though I didn't know the numbers and off the top of my head. But it's an often used phrase to give authority to the church, to explain what the true and only way to heaven is, and that's through Jesus. And I said, we were having a conversation, we were enjoying a meal. I said, maybe, just kind of go with me on this. Maybe Jesus is saying that the way is the only way, the path is the only direction towards the allegorical Father, and Jesus is simply saying he's become one with that way. He's one and the same. He's walked the path. The same way that maybe other people before him have, and other people after him will. The Buddha, for argument's sake, just throwing it out there. And she gave me kind of this look that I know very well, that you kind of know, like even though I felt I was humoring her, I realized that she was humoring me this entire time, and it wasn't really a conversation anymore. So I changed the subject, but at least we were cordial about it, and it was a completely amicable conversation. The reason I bring up these examples is because I don't think that dogma really is a big deal, comes into play for people who follow a religion. There's no more crusades. There's no more catastrophes over dogma. But it's very much in the details of the way you approach your religion. For my mother and this man, John, who I used to work for, it very much expressed how they chose to practice their religion, as opposed to what we commonly teach in the Theosophical Society, which is to move away from dogma and to enter this pathless land of figuring it out for yourself. But there is grace and there is spirituality and experience and all those wonderful things. But in the end, you need to figure it out for yourself, and you can't just do what you're told, which is a very convenient crutch, I think, and I understand why it's good for some people and bad for other people. I felt this was an important idea to address and kind of flesh out before talking about the Therapeutae or the Gnostics or any of that, because what we're talking about is, when I say in my title, the new God, that is the dogmatic God. When you say something new, you might think, okay, what are we going to come up with? But that kind of idea of faith is only 2,000 years old, and a much older version of God is an internal one, a more experiential one. And we treat it as if it's always been the way, at least in the West, maybe not in this building, but in the Western culture, it's understood that God is this external being that causes storms, and we can't know his ways, and it's all a mystery, and we just kind of have to hold on for dear life and pray for the good things, and they all come from God. That's a very different version of God than history would provide, at least spiritual history. So that is the new God. When just to cut to the chase of what I'm talking about with the new God, it's that idea. I have a quote from Helena Blavatsky from the Esoteric Character of the Gospels. She says, "The origin of all religions, Judeo-Christianity included, is to be found in a few primeval truths. And they, religions, are all more or less broken rays of the same Son of Truth, and their beginnings have to be sought in the archaic records of the wisdom religion. A thick film of allegory and blinds the dark sayings of fiction and parable, thus covers the original esoteric texts from which the New Testament, as now known, was compiled. Whence then the Gospels, the life of Jesus of Nazareth? Has it not been repeatedly stated that no human mortal brain could have invented the life of the Jewish reformer, followed by that awful drama on Calvary? We say on authority of the esoteric Eastern school that all this came from the Gnostics. As far as the name of Christos and the astronomical, mystical allegories are concerned, and from the writings of ancient Kabbalistic writings, the connection of Jesus or Joshua with the biblical personification." So that was kind of a long paragraph. Let me basically summarize that. What she's talking about is the idea that, and we'll be digging deeper and deeper into this, that there's a strong allegorical tradition that the Therapeutae and the Essenes, and after them the Gnostics, used as a form of teaching. And somewhere along with the Emperor Constantine, we turned this into a very literal interpretation to the point where we think the Gospels are a history book. And they don't ever say that Jesus never existed. They don't ever say anything like that. In fact, they affirm that in many points that he did. But who he is and who the stories are about are, if you were to say that it was just a story and just a historical idea, you'd be missing the point. It's an instructional idea. Even to the point of Jesus having 12 apostles, those are completely symbolic of the 12 zodiacal signs, which is, she was saying, astronomical. So there's a lot of little details like that that kind of hint to different things, and I'm not going to go into that ad nauseum. But I did want to talk about, since Michele talked about Job last week, that is a very Christian story, and the passion of Jesus, as he's getting worked over by various Roman soldiers and otherwise, it's very similar to the book of Job. That was the idea. And the instructions that they give are this idea, as she said, as Michele said last week, we begin as a pure soul with no wisdom, and the intention is to gain wisdom and still remain a pure soul in the end, or to go into corruption and redefine ourselves as a pure soul with wisdom. That's what the name Job means. It's short for Jacob, which means supplanter or replacer. You replace this innocent soul with a soul with experience. And part of the reason I know that is because it's a form of James. So I'm sure you all know the meanings of your names. You're narcissistic enough to research that, but that's the only reason I know that. In the Mahatma letters, they talk about Jesus as well. And this is a shorter quote, but he says, Mahatma KH says that he refers to the familiar simile made by the Christian adept, the Kabbalist Paul. And it's from Corinthians 3:16. He doesn't say that, but I looked it up. He says, "Know ye that ye are the temple of God, and in that Spirit of God dwelleth in you." He follows the point by saying, "Call it by whatever name, only let these unfortunate, deluded Christians know that the real Christ of every Christian is the Vash, the mystical voice, while the man Yeshu was but a mortal like any of us, an adept more by his inherent purity and ignorance of real evil than by what he had learned with his initiated rabbis and the already fast degenerating Egyptian hierophants and priests." And that kind of brings us to the point of talking about the Therapeutae. And I'm not going to keep pronouncing Therapeutae through the whole lecture, even though that's technically therapeutics is just as fine in the English language, so that's probably what I'm going to say, because I feel awkward saying the word Therapeutae over and over again. And it's commonly believed that the Therapeutics were a subsect of the Essenes, so you could use them interchangeably, but I will address some of the differences, and it's kind of interesting in how they applied their teachings and why we say that the Gnostics grew out of the Therapeutics and not the Essenes. The word Essene comes from a Syrian word, Asaya, which means healer or physician, and the Greek word is Therapeutis. So they're the same word in different languages. They both mean healer. So, however, the reason they had different names is because the way the esoteric tradition, which started around 200 BC, for this esoteric tradition of Judaism, they kind of became fed up with the temples of Judaism, even though there was always this Kabbalistic tradition. But they took that Kabbalistic tradition and started traveling to different geographical regions. The Therapeutics they intermingled with Greek philosophy and Egyptian philosophy. They were mostly found in the area between various ancient Egyptian cities and Alexandria, which if I had a map, you would see the Nile, and on the left side or on the west side of the Nile, north is Alexandria, right on the ocean, and then along the Nile are various ancient Egyptian cities. So basically, the Therapeutics were hidden in different caves along that river. And the Essenes were, you could call them cosmopolitan, not ascetics, but cosmopolitan esotericists. They were usually in the cities, especially in the University of Alexandria and various cities in what we call, or what we know as Palestine. So, as such, they did have different cultural traditions. Like the Essenes often lived in communities. They were mostly men, although they were allowed to marry, and they had jobs. And the Therapeutics were complete ascetics. They lived out in the wilderness. Both women and men could become Therapeutics. However, you were on your own. You were in a cave by yourself, which is probably why they allowed women to join that sect, because for whatever reason, like I imagine it had something to do with when you have both genders in a community together, and it was a predominantly male community, your mind goes off the spiritual path. And the Essenes were allowed to marry, as I said, but the Therapeutics, well, obviously, since they were out in the wilderness on their own, but it was a rule that they follow strict celibacy. They were also vegetarians, which was very uncommon for that day. They didn't participate in sacrifices, which was also very uncommon. They didn't own slaves. Their main practice was simply abstinence from sensuality and anger. They tried to practice love and never have anger, and they contemplative prayer. So it was more of a spiritual practice as we know today. I don't think we think of the spiritual life now as taking sheep or lambs to the temple and cutting their throats, but back then that was the more common way of prayer at the temple. Most of what we know about the Therapeutics today is from the historian Philo, and here is an excerpt from, and his book specifically was On the Contemplative Life, is the name of the writings, or the collection of writings that he had on them, and here's an excerpt. He said, "The therapeutic race, being continually taught to see without interruption, may well aim at obtaining a sight of the living God. Because of their anxious desire for an immortal and blessed existence, thinking that their mortal life has already come to an end, they leave their possessions to their sons or daughters, or perhaps to other relations, giving them up their inheritance with willing cheerfulness. And the interval between morning and evening is to them devoted wholly to meditation, on to practice of virtue, for they take up the sacred writings and philosophize concerning them, investigating the allegories of their national philosophy, since they look upon their literal expressions as symbols of some secret meaning in nature, intended to be conveyed in those figurative expressions." In one of the excerpts I read before, Blavatsky talked about blinds, and that's an important aspect in interpreting allegory. A blind is, it's almost like a misleading fact in an allegory. It's almost like you have to know the teaching before reading the explanation, which is kind of confusing in and of itself. A good explanation of a blind, which we might be familiar with, is the crucifixion. We think of the crucifixion as more like an execution of Jesus, but is very symbolic of physical manifestation. The cross itself represents the physical body, this T shape with arms, and if you put your legs together, and they're nailing this divine being to this cross, which very much represents how they view physical incarnation. We're all this divine being, and we're forced into this physical body, and it seems like a punishment, but it's really a pathway leading to the other side, and that's the same way it is with the story of Jesus. So that's just an example of a blind. And they were talking about the allegorical teachings, how they were a strong aspect of the Therapeutae and the Essenes. And one of them is a book which I'll be referring to in a second, just so I'm not talking completely conceptually. I should at least give it one example, but I'll get to that in a minute. Yeah, let's use the microphone, but yeah, I would be willing to listen to a question and answer it.
Did the therapeutics interact with the public at all?
No. Traditionally, no. A good example of how to... But it is understood that, or I should say it's speculated that sometimes one could be a therapeutic for a while and then eventually join an Essene community. A perfect example of that, I think, is John the Baptist, or at least how we often perceive John the Baptist as living in the wilderness. They said he wore camel hair and he ate beetles and that kind of thing, which I don't know how falls into vegetarianism, but that's just kind of how he's described as in many depictions nowadays. So that would be a good example of a therapeutic, living out in caves, that kind of thing. But it's also portrayed that John the Baptist eventually had this community of people and he was preaching, but that was more of his later idea. So at that point, he would be represented as an Essene. And historically, he's often referred to as an Essene. They don't talk about him as being a therapeutic. But that whole idea of living in the wilderness and just kind of meditating in the desert, that's what the therapeutics did. So I would speculate that he was a therapeutic for a time, and then he eventually became an Essene. So did they come into public? Probably when they were done doing the ascetic thing. Like, it's not like they were meant to serve, they were meant to love, and they were meant to heal. So it's commonly believed that therapeutics would become Essenes, but rarely in the writings do they speculate it would go the other way around. So I guess the answer is yes, but then they wouldn't be therapeutics anymore.
Like pedestrians.
Yeah, then they'd be, right, pedestrian therapeutics. So, I think it's always important when studying historical things to kind of ask the question, why do we care? Why is it important for us to learn this kind of thing? And the answer is because they often explained the difference between Jesus and Christ. And I think it gets us closer to finding Christ, as Blavatsky explains it, and as esoteric traditions might explain it. This redemptive idea instead of this God to dump all our problems on. In understanding where these teachings came from, and specifically what I'm talking about is following the tradition from Kabbalism through Essenism and the therapeutics, and then the therapeutics, it's believed, became the Gnostics, and then from the Gnostics we have modern-day Christianity. We can sort of plot why this very dogmatic, very literal interpretation of the Bible came about, and it's a lot easier for us to make up our own minds in that respect. History isn't perfect. They don't have... There's a lot of people who speculate and a lot of historians who have traces of things. So you could argue either way. Certain facts like when Jesus was alive, or what was his real name. Like, obviously it wasn't Jesus, but that's up to you, and that's up to you to make up your own mind. So I think it's very important to understand what people like the Therapeutae or the therapeutics believed and what the Essenes believed, and how that turned into Gnosticism. At least for me, I think that's... If you don't have an inherent interest in the historical aspect of these things, I think that's the reason why it's important to talk about it, so that you can more easily make up your own mind. So, talking about the Gnostics, they believe, came out of the therapeutics because they had a strong influence of Greek and Egyptian traditions. The Gnostics, you could say there were these closeted ascetics and these closeted, very well-kept communities of Essenes, which were mostly private. And then all of a sudden, at around 50 BC, it exploded into all these different tribes, and they all had their own different books and gospels and writings and teachings, and probably everyone who called themselves a Gnostic probably wrote their own stories, borrowing different concepts from Greek Greek understandings of the anthropomorphic God, and as well as the Hebrew the Kabbalistic understanding of an inherent sort of internal relationship with God. So the Gnostics brought about an explosion of this understanding, and everyone had a different interpretation, and that eventually was sort of brought in together by Constantine and congealed into what would become the Roman Church, and then that, of course, splintered off again into a million pieces, because that's how religion works. So the Gnostics, I think, are my great interest, and I've given talks on Gnosticism, and that's not what this talk is about. But the Gnostics, I think, when the allegories became very popular, and there's the Nag Hammadi library, which is a library they discovered of all these different Gnostic books. I think those are the richest tradition of different stories to interpret, and most of them involve the creation story or the Jesus story. So I think that studying those are a great understanding of the esoteric Christian tradition. So the point was to, and I have a book here, the Therapeutae, the Essenes and Their Initiations by Swinburne Clymer. The point was to reach what many esoteric traditions are trying to reach, which is initiation, and what that means specifically is a real understanding of your own personal divinity. It's one thing to say that we're all God. It's one thing to say that we're all one, and that's a well-understood idea. But to actually exemplify it is, it takes more than one lifetime, as many people talk about. In the Sufi tradition, there's a symbol on many different great figures in Sufism. They're wearing mirrors, or the symbol itself of the mirror is a popular theme in Sufi tradition, which, as another esoteric tradition, they all basically teach the same thing. When you study them enough, you can kind of see the thread. And the mirror, as a symbol, is representative of what we are to become in our consciousness. We are meant to try to take this idea of God or divinity and not pretend that we are it, but simply realize that we reflect it. We try to become transparent so that the divine nature within us becomes revealed to our own consciousness and the world. So that's what the mirror interprets, and that was the intention of all these people. I have an excerpt I'm going to read from this book that I was just talking about, describing the initiation, not just describing the intent of the initiation, which I kind of summarized, but I think the language is really interesting. He says, "The union of God with the soul is the principle of all mystical life. But this union, the fullness and final consummation of which cannot be experienced till death has been passed through and eternity has been achieved. And this can be accomplished on earth in a more or less perfect manner. And the literature of the entire mysticism has no other end than to unveil to us, by a full and profound analysis of the different stages of evolution in the spirit of man." Here the illusory phenomena of the visible world are regarded as informed with the inner pneumatic significance to divine, which is a chief end of mysticism. In order to make progress, it is necessary that the aspirant, shaping all practical life in conformity with this theory, should perform no outward act except with a view to its inward meaning. All things are of time and earth, and man being simply figures and symbols of heaven and God. So basically what he's saying is at all times you're aware of the divinity, not just in yourself, but in everything around you, and you realize that while these stories we read are allegories, real life is also an allegory. And you realize that in every moment and in every step. It's kind of like mindfulness meditation on steroids, but I'm just trying to relate to you the gravity of what this is all about. Like I said, it's one thing to know and understand and say we are all God, we're all, God is within me, I am a seed of divinity, and that's well and good, but this is a true mountain, and that's why it's often now symbolically called a mountain to climb. And that's what they were after, and that's what Christianity at one point was all about. So, moving on, I wanted to talk about the book of Baruch, which is a writing, they call it a Jewish Gnostic book, but that's kind of a misnomer. The idea is there are many Gnostic Gospels, as I said, but this book is older than the Gospel of Mark, it's theorized, as well as older than the Gospel of Thomas. So it was kind of somewhere in between this therapeutic tradition and when the Christianity began. And, well, let me just read it, and then I'll kind of explain the implication. So, what?
Are you finished with the therapeutic?
Yes, I'm finished. Did you have a question?
I have a question.
Okay.
What's the relationship of healing with this spiritual quest?
They did study healing. They did research herbs and all different types to heal. But what they felt is, and the reason they named themselves as healers, was because they felt that their practice was the true healing that mattered, the healing of the soul and the healing of the ultimate issue, which is this idea of separateness. So that's why they call themselves healers. But that's a good question. So this is an excerpt from the book of Baruch. And the angel, Baruch is an angel being sent by, they call it the good. It's kind of the initial manifestation of God just after the unmanifested. And he had just come from talking to Moses, and after he talked to Moses, he talked to Hercules, and then after he talked to Hercules, he got here. In the days of King Herod, Baruch was sent by Elohim, and he came to Nazareth and found Jesus, son of Joseph and Mary, feeding sheep, a boy of 12. And he told him everything that had happened from the beginning, from Edom and Elohim and all that will be. He said, "All the prophets before you were seduced, but Jesus, earthly son, try not to be seduced and preach the word to people, and tell them about the Father and the good, and ascend to the good, and sit with Elohim, Father of us all." And Jesus obeyed the angel. He said, "Lord, I will do all things." He affirmed this. Naas wanted to seduce him too, which I presume is some sort of demon or unhealthy spiritual being. Naas wanted to seduce him too, but he could not. Jesus kept faith with Baruch. Then Naas was enraged because he could not seduce him, and he had him crucified. Jesus left his body to Edom by the tree and ascended to the good. He said to her, "Woman, here is your son." He left his soul and earthly body, but his spirit he placed in the hands of the Father, and then he ascended to the good. So there's a lot of, this is a very simple kind of way of telling the story, and you can see in the Gospels a much more complex idea of Jesus. This is a very kind of basic idea, and it's only just a part of that whole gospel. He's not even the main character. He's just the sort of triumphant character after, as I said, he talked to Moses and Hercules, and then he came to Jesus. And there's this idea of ascension, which is retained in the Gospels that came afterwards. But for the people who were writing it at the time, they were understanding that Jesus was a symbol of something that can be perfect, but comes from an earthly place. Notice how they said he was the son of Joseph and Mary. Yes.
What's the date of that writing?
According to the Barnstone and Mayer, who compiled this book called the Gnostic Bible, it's 70 A.D. And the book of Mark, and as well, they kind of carbon date the Gospel of Thomas, which is not canonical. There's the canonical book of Mark is speculated anywhere between 70 A.D. and 200 A.D. So there's a wide berth for the different Gospels, but most historians agree that Mark is probably the oldest, and I stress probably. So that's the book of Baruch, and notice how we don't even hear about Baruch, so it was just in whatever tradition they created. Well, I guess we can wrap it up and get to questions, but I just wanted to read one last quote from HBB because she has so many different quotes on Christians, and they get kind of funny, and I don't think I can relate to them perfectly up here, but she loves the heart of Christianity, and she kind of despises with a passion, and it's often conveyed in these very colorful sayings and quotes she has, what they've done to Christianity. And if you learn about some of the things and you look at what Constantine and the Crusades did, you can kind of relate to it. So I'm just going to read the quote very quickly. "The inspirers of primitive Christianity were the most cultured, the most learned, and the most wealthy of the Christian name. Neither they nor their humbler followers were in danger of accepting the dead letter of their own texts. But it was different with the victims of the fabricators of what is now called Orthodox and historic Christianity." And I leave it off there. She goes on, but that basically summarizes my point to a T. I feel that everyone should explore this idea on their own. Everyone should read the different stories and kind of see how they resonate with you. I strongly recommend the Gnostic Bible, which has the book of Baruch in it, as well as other things like the Gospel of Thomas. And I find, for me, as someone who's raised in the Christian faith, they really speak to me, and they really kind of give an esoteric understanding of a very familiar story I have, and not a dogmatic one. And for me, I feel that it's strengthened, my faith, in quotes, in some way. But as stories as well as spiritual instructions, I think they have a very rich meaning. So that's why I thought a talk about this was important. And I'm not a historian, so if I was, I'd probably talk more about the actual historic connection between the Kabbalists as we got to the modern day Christianity. But I do enjoy stories, so that's kind of how I approached it. So I encourage everyone to approach it that way on their own as well.
I think the beauty of no matter what religion, each religion is born out of another religion, and there's a constant evolving. The older religions they've given a new name. It doesn't mean that religion has changed. It's just a way of honoring, and each one has their own beauty. I'd like to ask a question, and it's not out of any prejudice whatsoever.
Okay.
I've just been trying to find out how Hitler got involved. You say he was. I'm not talking from anything that has happened.
It just sounds like a very difficult question right away.
There are no accidents.
Uh-huh.
And there's no blame here. He must have been where he needed to be to do what he had to do. But I didn't realize where he started out from, I guess. So I thank you for moving in that direction.
Carl Jung said something very interesting about Hitler, and Carl Jung, as you know, was a respected German psychologist in the time that Hitler was in power. And he was going to have an audience with Hitler, And for some reason, it didn't happen, but one of his friends it was recorded, so one of his friends, or possibly a journalist, asked him if he regrets not being able to have a personal audience with Hitler, and he said, it wouldn't have mattered if I had, because he's not a real human being. He's just a shell of an idea that a nation is pushing forward. So there is no Hitler, is what he was saying. There's just this shell that a nation is kind of projecting onto. Plus, he was on so many amphetamines all the time that he was basically just on autopilot all the time, I imagine.
A couple points. Each of the Gospels, I understand, was really a community. In other words, there was a Mark community, there was a Luke community, there was a Matthew community. That's why they tell the story differently, because they were developed within a community.
You can take it further than that. They look at the Gospels and realize that some of them, like a third of the way through, kind of switch speaking styles, and then another third of the way through switch again. So there are multiple Mark communities kind of working on this book.
Sure, over years, I mean.
Okay.
Secondly, the Kabbalah tradition was really, like a 1200 invention from previous probably information, but the actual formalization of Kabbalah and the Zohar didn't occur until 1200 or so, 1250. So I don't know what they referred to, the Jewish mystical tradition back when the Gnostics were in. That's just a point.
Okay. Well, I think Kabbalah is just a very convenient term for them to use for esoteric Judaism. What they're actually talking about is these wisdom traditions that Blavatsky refers to, and the oldest recorded wisdom tradition or rite of initiation they have, which is similar to like Freemasonry or various different groups of people who have a formalized practice of stories. So I think the oldest one is the wisdom tradition of Demeter, which means of the earth, and there's a goddess called Demeter as well in Greek mythology. But before she was made into a Greek goddess, she was more of an idea of the divine earth connected with the divine essence. So that wisdom tradition is 1500 BC, and that's the oldest one they have recorded, and it's commonly understood that there are more that one pulled from. So when they say Kabbalah, they're talking about whatever esoteric Jewish rites of initiation they had at that time. I don't know if they called it Kabbalah then, but the Judaism always had this aspect of mystical initiation even before they kind of intermingled with Egypt. So it's just a convenient word. So no, I understand what you're saying, but I don't know what else they would call it, so they just call it Kabbalah. Yes?
I'm trying to see the connection between the Therapeutics and the Gnostics and how they evolved from each other. Did the Therapeutic have any figure like Jesus or the Christ, or the Gnostics are the Therapeutics after having met Jesus? Or
They had Christ. They didn't have Jesus. And eventually, Jesus and Christ merged into this similar idea. It was Christos and Krestos were both words that they used back then. In the Greek culture and the therapeutic culture, I don't know what word they would have used in the Essene culture, because, as Ed said, it might be the same words they used. Well, no, I'm not talking about like a savior.
Christ is a translation of Messiah or whatever, of Messiah, the anointed one, basically.
Right.
So those terms were equivalent.
Okay. Let me finish answering that question, and then I'll get to that. But they had this idea of the redemptive principle, which eventually became known as the Christ eon, the Christ eon in Gnosticism, and Christ was about redemption and about this idea that there's always this allegory of the fall and the redemption, just as Michele had talked about. And Christ was the principle that redeemed you, which symbolically is the awareness, or the gradual awareness that divinity is within you. That is the Christ principle, and that was the Savior figure, and it was expressed in different areas. Hercules represents that Christ principle. Moses represents that Christ principle, which is why they were both in these stories. And Jesus was like the new Moses or the new Jesus in these stories, or at least the character, not the historical person, obviously. But it's my understanding in Judaism that Messiah referred to as an actual person who's going to lead them, the anointed one. So this is a different idea. This is which eventually they became confused, like the Greek word Christos, and which means a good person or a good man, and the word Christos, which means the anointed one. So it's a lot of ideas. Basically, to sum it up, so it's not just a lot of confusing details, there were a lot of different ideas that over time, because of cultures kind of clashing together, just got smushed into one idea. And nowadays, most, like what Jesus Christ, as we understand it from the Gospels, is like 10 different things amalgamated into one thing.
The idea of the Jews looked for the Messiah. That was always their search. They never found the Messiah. Mm-hmm. But they did respect Jesus as a teacher, and a prophet, rather. Thank you. Yes.
And remember when I was explaining what a blind was? That is a perfect example of a blind. Calling Jesus Christ the Messiah, what they're conveying is, they're not conveying literally he's the Messiah, he's the Savior the Jews are looking for. He's saying the Savior that the Jews are looking for is an inner principle, which is an inner relationship or a realization of God and divinity. That's the real Messiah. Stop looking for a person who's going to lead you.
Yeah, I mean, even the Jews might have, or the common Jews may have made Messiah too literally also. I mean, maybe the original, prophet had to do with that. It's allegory. Find the Messiah within yourself, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Another thing is, it's only recently, I understand, like in the 1800s, that people started taking the Bible literally.
Oh?
Yes.
That's brand new information to me.
Really?
Yes.
Before they couldn't read it.
Oh, because...
Yeah.
Wait, Pablo just said before they couldn't read it because it was in Latin and only the papacy would read Latin. Well, regardless, I guarantee they weren't reading it allegorically, because otherwise the Crusades would not have happened. But I also know, what little I do know about Judaism is most people studying in Judaism were not allowed access to the Kabbalistic teachings until they're at least 40 years old. So there's a whole population of people under 40 who are believing in the literal interpretation of at least the Talmud and the Old Testament, or the Pentateuch. But in Christianity, I think it's the same thing. I think it was literal. But I'll have to look that up. You've intrigued me. But I don't believe it. So I'm challenging that idea. Okay.
So I have a question back on the therapeutics once again. They were, as you explained, kind of led an ascetic lifestyle in the hills. How do they apply their trade as healers if they're not amongst people?
The healers, for them, would be purely spiritual. As I was explaining to Ed, the reason they chose the name healers, I mean, there was this idea that in learning how to heal, from the... Do you know Paracelsus? Paracelsus? Blavatsky refers to him a lot. He was a well-known physician, but he frustrated all the doctors of his time because he couldn't explain how he knew stuff. He just knew it because he was
enemies of the doctors.
Right. So he had this spiritual connection which allowed him access to this physical understanding of how to heal the body. I think that's why they studied healing, primarily because they believed in that connection, that if you understood how the body worked and the elements that healed the body, it would yield deeper spiritual understanding. So they studied these things, but it's not like they were all doctors for hire. In fact, I don't think most of them did any actual practical medicine. So it was spiritual practice and a spiritual education, and it was emblematic, the same way that Freemasons call themselves Masons, but they don't actually build anything, the majority of them. So that's the idea.
We have a question from the... Al asks, you said at the beginning of your talk that one begins with a pure soul and obtains wisdom as one follows one's path. Is there a similarity in the sources of some of the wisdom?
And there's a similarity.
Buddhism has teachings attributed to Siddhartha. Christianity has the Bible. Muslims have the Quran. Theosophy has Blavatsky's writings.
There's a similarity in all of the wisdom. That's the entire. I'm sorry, I didn't make that clear. That's the entire point, in my opinion, of the second object of the Theosophical Society. That's why we study all these diverse religions, is to understand at the core they are all essentially the same teaching. So that's why I'm referring to Sufism as I'm talking about this, and we're talking about Kabbalism. It's one and the same thing. I remember the author Philip Gowans came here. He wrote a book on... He wrote the book Practical Sufism, which we publish. And he was a very interesting guy. I enjoyed talking to him casually as he was here. And he asked me if I was interested in Sufism or if that was a particular interest of mine because we were talking about it and we were talking about his book. And I said, I gravitate more towards the Gnostic teachings. That's kind of what I enjoy the most. And he kind of smiled and looked at me and he's like, is there really a difference? And I'm like, I guess not. And he's like, well, all right then. So that's the answer. I agree with him in that there's no difference between any of them, especially the more you learn about them. You see all the similarities.